The introduction to The Stately Homo, a celebration of the life of Quentin Crisp, edited by Paul Bailey. Introduction by Paul Bailey. Dennis Charles Pratt was in his early 20s when he made what was to prove an irreversible decision. He renamed himself Quentin Crisp. Inspired by the beauties of the silver screen, and by the German actress Brigitte Helm, who starred in Fritz Lang's M in particular, he became the nearest thing to a femme fatale as is possible for a man. With the aid of mascara, rouge, lipstick, and powder, he transformed the face he considered plain into an unmistakable work of art. He dyed his hair with henna and proclaimed the effeminacy he had been told, even ordered, to suppress. He was suddenly one of the peculiar sights of London. The year was 1931. The bright young things of the previous decade were already beginning to fade away, and frivolousness was going out of fashion. Quentin's timing, on reflection, couldn't have been worse. As the 30s progressed, with fascism steadily asserting itself throughout Europe, people grew more serious and more anxious. The spectacle of a man with boldly painted toenails mincing along the city's streets was certain to annoy and offend the average man and woman trying to raise a family on very little money, though there must have been a few tolerant spirits who found it amusing or intriguing. He was aware that his very appearance would inspire both contempt and derisive laughter, yet on he walked, paying no attention to the abuse that greeted him daily. 25 years earlier, the music hall singer and dancer Fred Barnes had paraded himself in a similar way. His makeup was more rudimentary than Quentin's, a little rouge to color his cheeks, and a discreet dab of powder. He wore white cashmere +4s with garish pink stockings, and often had a marmoset perched on his shoulder. Barnes at that time was enjoying an immense success. He was, by nature, a kind and generous individual, and his radiant smile disconcerted anyone inclined to mock him, and besides, he was on the stage. He was regarded as a harmless eccentric, which, in fact, he was. He was seldom without an obliging sailor to keep him happy, and was frequently seen in their company. Barnes' passion for the boys in blue would lead to his being barred from the Royal Tournament, the annual naval, military, and aviation tattoo, at London's Olympia Stadium in 1925. In subsequent years, his sailor friends would smuggle him into the building, to the annoyance of the military police who were there to deter him. In his autobiography, The Naked Civil Servant, Quentin recalls that on his first visit to Portsmouth, he was asked the question, "Do you know Fred Barnes?" His interrogator was, of course, a sailor. When Dennis was transmogrified into Quentin, Barnes's career was all but finished. His once pretty face had been coarsened by excessive drinking, and even his most loyal fans now found his performance an embarrassment. In common with any number of unhappy homosexuals, he committed suicide. In his heyday, he had exhibited an absurd courage, a kind that Quentin would assume and maintain for the rest of his long life. It was absurd only in the sense that the prevailing moral climate made it so. "I wore makeup at a time when even on women eyeshadow was sinful," Quentin observed with a certain pride. If you were a homosexual, you were expected to be ashamed of yourself. You had two alternatives to consider: celibacy or the love of a good woman. The current Bishop of Liverpool favors the first, and Lord Longford recommended the second in a recent debate in the House of Lords. If you were homosexual and of an effeminate disposition, you could, if you possessed the necessary talent, make fun of yourself in public, to the delight of a largely heterosexual audience. The camp comic has long been accepted in British society, especially when he has a touch of genius, like Frankie Howard. Being queenly, within the confines of a theater or music hall, was radically different from being queenly in the open air anonymously. Such behavior was encouraged and applauded when it was practiced behind the footlights, but scorned if it reached the streets. For many gay people today, such comedians have outstayed their welcome. Julian Clary, who felt liberated after seeing the film of The Naked Civil Servant, reveals in his contribution to this book that his severest criticism comes from the gay press. "I think I have a right to be a stereotype," he says, rebutting the charge constantly leveled against him. Quentin Crisp was in earnest when he asserted his right to be as effeminate as he wished in what Auden famously called a low, dishonest decade. He had no intention, then or after, of making fun of himself or screaming it up for the gallery. He wanted simply to be the person he felt he had to be. What he was funny about, sometimes riotously so, was the world itself. He had a shrewd ear and eye for pretentiousness and self-delusion. I remember that in middle age he was cast in the role of agony aunt by a man in his 20s who was forever imagining that he was deeply in love with attractive teenage boys. One notably handsome youth had insisted on a sizable loan before disappearing from London. The man sat on Quentin's bed in tears. "He promised to pay it back, and I trusted him," he complained. "Let us face it, Mr. C," remarked Quentin in his quietest tone, "your feelings regarding this impoverished lad were not entirely altruistic." His boyhood ambition was to be a chronic invalid. He enjoyed the drama of illness because it caused him to be the center of everyone's attention. The frail and sickly Dennis, who was born on Christmas Day, 1908, played those bedroom scenes for all they were worth. "My lust for praise was inordinate. Only the servants made any attempt to satisfy it. For them I danced incessantly and recited poems that I made up as I went along. I did not realize, when they applauded me, that clapping might be a welcome change from dusting," he writes in the opening chapter of his memoir. His father, a somewhat feckless solicitor, never attempted to disguise the repugnance he felt for this fey third son. His mother, although sometimes exasperated, was more sympathetic, while his brothers and sister appear to have tolerated the monstrous show-off with bemusement, but Mr. Pratt's reaction was always apoplectic. Perhaps the experience in childhood of a parent's open disgust prepared the future Quentin Crisp in some measure for the hostility he would need to combat with courtesy and a feigned good humor. The enemy was already there in the house in Sutton, Surrey, when Dennis was tiny. No wonder that, as Quentin, he would learn to protect himself with a carapace of steel. His refusal to succumb to self-pity was, and is, still heroic. After his father's early death, relations between Quentin and his mother warmed considerably. His brothers and sister made gentle fun of him. At the end of his life, he basked in the warmth of affection demonstrated to him by his nieces, great-niece, and his extended American family. In one respect, he became that unlikely being, a family man. He attended a preparatory school in Epsom, and then went on to a boarding school, Denstone College, on the borders of Staffordshire and Derbyshire. He tried to beguile and seduce his masters, but with no success. He discovered the comforts of masturbation and slept with an Indian boy, preferring the solitary activity by far. He wasn't popular with his fellow students. Quote, "To this day I have a mark on my wrist where boys sawed through the flesh with a jagged ruler. For this and other reasons I hated school, but it was as well that I went there. It provided a dress rehearsal for the treatment I was to receive in the streets of London in a few years' time." End quote. In 1926, when Fred Barnes eluded the phalanx of military policemen for the second time, Dennis studied journalism at King's College, London, but did not merit a diploma. He was no more successful at art classes in Battersea and the Regent Street Polytechnic. He migrated towards the Black Cat Cafe in Old Compton Street, a seedy establishment patronized by extremely effeminate male prostitutes. Dennis joined their ranks for 6 months, in the vain hope that a customer might turn out to be the lover he was looking for. Quote, "I disliked the coarseness of the situations in which I found myself. Courtship consisted of walking along the street with a man who had my elbow in a merciless grip, until we came to a dark doorway. Then he said, 'This'll do.' These are the only words of tenderness that were uttered to me." End quote. His family had moved from Battersea to High Wycombe when he walked his mother's chow in the nearby fields and endured the dreary ritual of suburban life. Then, one day, Mrs. Pratt vanished without disclosing her whereabouts. Father and son began to communicate at last. They went on talking to each other until she reappeared. "The trouble is, you look like a male whore," said Mr. Pratt, at the close of their brief friendship. This cheered me up a little, as I had not then taken my final vows. I was in a twilight state between sin and virtue. The remark was the first acknowledgment that he had ever made of any part of my problem. In gratitude, I promised that when I went up to London at Christmas, I would try not to come back. He took his final vows. Quote, "I realized that it did no good to be seen to be homosexual in the West End, where sin reigned supreme, or in Soho, which was inhabited exclusively by other outcasts of various kinds, but the rest of England was straightforward missionary country. It was densely populated by aborigines who had never heard of homosexuality, and who, when first they did, became frightened and angry. I went to work on them. The message I wished to propagate was that effeminacy existed in people who were in all other respects just like home." End quote. Now, as Quentin Crisp, he was his own man. The days of wearing mufti were behind him. He was not to become a drag queen. That would have been too obvious for him, and too easy. On the sole occasion he wore a woman's dress in public, no one bothered to look at him. A tiresome situation for a determined exhibitionist. His clothes, which were often second-hand, were carefully chosen. The fedora was a constant, as was the flowing silk or chiffon scarf. He bought shoes that were at the very least a size too small for him, thus ensuring that his walk would be constrained. In fine weather, he donned sandals and painted his toenails. Both Anne Valery and George Melly, who met him at the end of the Second World War, remember how beautiful he looked at first sight. They were introduced to him when he was happiest in England. In 1939 he had attempted to join the army but was declined, quote, "totally exempt, suffering from sexual perversion," end quote, after a medical examination. He was presented with a certificate testifying to his perverted condition. With the arrival of the American forces in Britain, Quentin, along with many others, straight and gay, knew an unanticipated bliss. The GIs were instantly friendly, generous with cigarettes and money, and randy as hell. Labeled "With love from Uncle Sam," and packaged in uniforms so tight that in them their owners could fight for nothing but their honor, these bundles for Britain leaned against the lamp-posts of Shaftesbury Avenue, or lolled on the steps of thin-lipped statues of dead English statesmen. As they sat in the cafes or stood in the pubs, their bodies bulged through every straining khaki fiber towards our feverish hands. Their voices were like warm milk, their skins as flawless as expensive Indian rubber, and their eyes as beautiful as glass. Above all, it was the liberality of their nature that was so marvelous. Never in the history of sex was so much offered to so many by so few. By 1945, the supply was running out, and the happy orgy about to end. One evening, a kind woman friend of Quentin's brought him a GI to a party. "He's a bit small, but they're getting difficult to find," she announced, as she handed him over to the grateful Quentin. With only one of these soldiers did he have anything like a sustained relationship, as Paul Robinson notes in his brilliantly perceptive essay on The Naked Civil Servant. But Quentin was not upset when the man had to return to the United States. He was perfectly content to be alone again. If Quentin ever really enjoyed sex, other than masturbation, it was with those undemanding servicemen, who, once gratified, smiled, said thanks, and went on their way. He gives the impression, in his writings and pronouncements, that homosexual intercourse is a bit of an endurance test, a chore that has to be undertaken when requested, but is better avoided. He frequently used the word unpleasant to describe it, a point taken up after his death by a journalist in the Daily Mail, the queer-bashing British tabloid magazine. The Mail's readers are expected to approve of a homosexual man who declares his sexual predilection to be an illness, and the act itself unpleasant. This is the love the sinner, hate the sin school of thought that once passed for liberalism in the darkest days of English bigotry. I find it hard, when I was coming to terms with being gay, as in the 1950s, when all my lovers, with one delightful exception, were married. It's a view that continues to be voiced by the right wing of the Conservative Party, and in papers like the Mail and the Daily Telegraph. Quentin's comments on homosexuality are challenged here by the novelist and critic Philip Hencher, who rejects the whole notion of shame. It seems clear now that sex was not high among Quentin Crisp's concerns. His two longest liaisons were bizarre by any standards. One was with a huge man he calls Barn Door in his autobiography. Barn Door lived in Quentin's squalid room at 129 Beaufort Street for 3 years before decamping. He is the man at the table, eating eggs and bacon, and reading a comic, propped up against a milk bottle, whom Harold Pinter writes about in his evocative piece. Barn Door liked eating and sleeping and little else, it is safe to assume. What scant sexual contact there was is described by Quentin as Neolithic. The other relationship was even more peculiar. A woman friend, who eventually entered a convent and became a nun, lived with a Czech for several years. He eventually went mad and had to be placed in an institution, where the woman visited him every week over a long period. Just before she took the veil, she asked Quentin if he would visit him as well to ease her burden. Quentin dutifully obliged, even though he didn't care for the man. Indeed, he considered him a bore. The journey to the home took 2 hours by train, and Quentin usually stayed with the Czech for an hour or so. The whole process cost him the train fare and over 5 hours of his time, and yet he continued to visit the boring man, despite the fact that he was unappreciative of Quentin's efforts to entertain and interest him. Then the Czech wrote him a letter in Old English, with the news that he would be visiting him instead. Quentin was relieved by this message, since he had begun to find the trip to the institution tiring. The Czech turned up in Chelsea, gave Quentin a surprising kiss, and an affair of sorts commenced. The Czech was 70, and Quentin was middle-aged. The Czech had his pleasure while the object of his desire thought of different matters, and yearned for the dreaded event to end. Armed with bedraggled flowers and bearing gifts from the institution's kitchen of molten chocolate and collapsed meat pies, the Czech would climb the stairs to Quentin's room, and have his way with his increasingly reluctant innamorato. Why did Quentin never say no? The answer is hidden in this stoical observation, quote, "The whole thing was pathetically inevitable. This was the measure of his loneliness. I was the limit of his degradation." End quote. Of the opening foray, Quentin writes, quote, "His hair and his whole body were covered with cod liver oil. He explained that if taken internally it was salubrious, then it must likewise be good for the skin. Also, as I saw for myself, it turned his hair gold. This, he felt, made him look younger and more desirable. Until this moment it had always puzzled me that fish did not bother with propinquity, but instead conducted the business of procreation by remote control. I understood them now." End quote. Whatever the wretched circumstances, the wit in Quentin was always capable of rising above them and illuminating them with the power of artifice. He was the crotchety nymph before his elderly satyr, a role he sustained with difficulty. Even in depravity I lacked stamina. If Quentin had died at the age of 60, he would have been remembered solely by the people who had savored his aphorisms and read The Naked Civil Servant. In the final chapter of the book, he outlines a plan for compulsory euthanasia under the aegis of a Ministry of Death. Quote, "This august body of men, all preferably under 30 years of age, would deal with the chore of exterminating old people. Before everything else, they would have to agree upon a time limit, say 60, to live beyond which would be an offense punishable with life. Then the ministry would have to make sure that, 6 months before his 60th birthday, every living being received a notice offering post-dated congratulations and advising him which town hall he would be required to visit on the happy occasion. A week before his birthday, he would receive a final notice, and then, at the glorious hour, unless he preferred to walk there on his own 2 feet, the van would call to take him to oblivion." End quote. When he wrote that passage, he had no idea that he would live long enough to achieve the ambition of his lifetime, and not only visit, but settle in New York. He often talked of dying in those days, in a rather jocular manner. Perhaps he thought that, with the publication of his autobiography, there was nothing more for him to do but live, a prospect that didn't please him. But the good luck that began with Philip O'Connor's radio interview for the Radio 3 series London Characters in 1963, recounted here by Andrew Barrow, which led to Tom Mashler, the chief editor at the publishing house Jonathan Cape, inviting him to write a memoir, continued when the scriptwriter Philip Mackey and the director Jack Gold managed to find the money to make a television film of the book. The inspired casting of John Hurt, who speaks affectionately of Quentin in these pages, was largely responsible for its huge and justified success. With its screening in 1975, Quentin Crisp truly became a household name, and more importantly, a figure of affection, where once he had been a despised outcast. His achievement was now recognized as heroic, a fact that we, who called ourselves his friends, had acknowledged for years. Quentin was well into his blue period when I first met him in the late 1950s. He had abandoned his red-headed persona earlier in the decade. The blue, or mauve, rinse was still in fashion among sophisticated middle-aged women, and Quentin seemed to be following their example. Our meeting took place at 129 Beaufort Street, the lodging house in Chelsea, where he occupied a room he hadn't cleaned since 1940. The actress Gillian Rayne and I had been invited there by an actor friend, Gordon Richardson, who lived in marginally less squalor on the ground floor. It was through Gordon that the playwright Ronald Harwood met Quentin, as he reveals in his funny and charming piece. Quentin wafted into Gordon's apartment, and Mr. Richardson introduced Miss Rayne and Mr. Bailey to Mr. Crisp. We sat down to tea and cucumber sandwiches. Quentin was, as ever, in aphoristic mood, and a series of dodgy truisms flowed from his lips. It seemed pointless to argue with him. I listened respectfully and laughed when laughter was the only possible response. While we were eating and drinking, Gordon removed his glass eye, polished it with a grubby handkerchief, and popped it back into his socket. Gillian, Quentin, and I pretended not to notice. The tenants of number 129 were a pretty odd bunch. Gordon always insisted that Quentin was the one sane person in the building, and I think he was probably right. I was never sure if the stories Gordon related with such relish were apocryphal, but they were definitely entertaining. There was Miss B, who lived on the same floor as Quentin. Her ravenous sexual appetite was the subject of fairly constant discussion. She would leave the house late at night on her bicycle, and make for a cafe in Crouch End that was patronized by long-distance lorry drivers. She and the driver of her choice would awaken the other lodgers, except for the deaf model in the attic, in the small hours by banging on the front door and clumping up the stairs. Many of these men were disconcerted and dazzled by the vision of Quentin, in his shift, emerging from the bathroom in the morning. It was Quentin and Miss B.'s custom to go to the Forum Cinema on Fulham Road every Wednesday afternoon. On one especially memorable Wednesday, she joined him in the hallway dressed in a nun's habit. Quentin was appalled. He asked her where and how she had acquired the outfit. "That would be telling," she replied. The blue-haired Quentin stated firmly that he wouldn't be seen dead with her in the street wearing religious clothing. He walked a few paces behind her. On arriving at the cinema, he realized what was going on in Miss B.'s mind. The film showing was The Nun's Story, and it was Miss B.'s devious plan to get to see it free of charge. The cashier insisted that she pay for her ticket, while the shameless Miss B. protested, "But I am a nun. I, too, am a nun." The cashier asserted that she had her job to do, nuns or no nuns, and if Sister didn't pay, Sister wouldn't be let in. Since Sister had no money on her person, Quentin was obliged to buy the ticket. According to Gordon, he sat a considerable distance away from her. He had found the entire episode acutely embarrassing. Worse was to ensue. The habit vanished. It was returned to the theatrical costumer, from whom it had been hired, but in its place came a newfound faith. Miss B. had seen the light. Midnight trips to Crouch End were relegated to her sinful past, and a Roman Catholic priest became her most regular visitor. Quentin and Gordon were subjected to lectures delivered in a furious voice on their wickedness. She urged them to change their ways before it was too late. One afternoon, as she was chastising them over tea in Gordon's front room, Quentin managed to interrupt her for a moment by observing, politely, "I think I preferred you when you were a nymphomaniac." It was virtually impossible to upstage Quentin, but someone did at once. It happened at one of Gordon's extraordinary parties. There was only Pernod to drink, in glasses that bore traces of lipstick, and the food was served on plates that showed evidence of previous meals. Standing by the mantelpiece, holding on to it for dear life actually, was an ancient queen who kept announcing in tremulous tones that he was Oscar Wilde's last lover. Whenever Gordon took someone over to meet him, he would follow the obligatory "How do you do?" with the refrain, "I think you should know that I was Oscar Wilde's last lover." The man died shortly afterwards, and Quentin's star status was restored when the next bash took place. Then it was the priest's turn to misbehave, no doubt fired by Gordon's lethal measures of Pernod. He left Miss B. to insult the more jaded-looking guests, who were there in plenty, and went upstairs with a television newsreader, male, with whom he was caught in flagrante in somebody's wardrobe. The news of this unlikely conjunction spread fast, and the blushing pair made a hasty exit in different directions. Gordon was overjoyed, Quentin amused. Miss B. was rendered silent. The owner of 129 Beaufort Street was a remarkable woman named Violet Vi Vereker. She was a devoted socialist, and an early member of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. A Quentin, who eagerly awaited the bomb as the ideal solution to the world's ills, teased her when she entreated him to join her on the march to Aldermaston. Despite the fact that she was a landlady, Vi Vereker scorned bourgeois attitudes and conventions, as she made clear when Gordon and Quentin complained about the smelly tramp who had taken up residence in the front hallway. The man had moved in one day when the door had been left open, bearing a carrier bag, a rickety chair, and a Primus stove. He positioned himself under the stairs, away from drafts, and cooked the supply of food he had brought with him. When it ran out, Vi appeared with bread and meat and told him to stay as long as he wanted. She accused both Gordon and Quentin, whom she had always regarded as the kind of unconventional people she admired, of being petty-minded and uncharitable. Even so, the tenants of 129 were relieved when the tramp moved on. At the end of that first tea party, I said good-bye to Quentin with a remark he accepted as a high compliment. I told him that he was a character in a Ronald Furbank novel. I suppose I meant that he sounded as Furbank intended his people to sound, while the rest of us were talking in half-sentences. His every utterance was polished and elegant. I realized later that he had been honing his verbal gems almost since the day in 1931 when he invented himself. I wondered if he rehearsed them in private. I remember inviting him to dinner just after the television documentary about him was broadcast and before The Naked Civil Servant was made. He was enjoying the notoriety that came in the wake of the program. One of the other guests was my former drama teacher at the Central School, who was born in the same year as Quentin. Oliver was one of those discreet homosexuals from the Edwardian era, who believed, as the saying used to go, that you should never drop hairpins in public. Quentin had not only been dropping them for 40 years, he'd scattered them liberally as well. The younger guests were diverted by Quentin that evening, but Oliver remained frozen-faced. Quentin, sensing correctly that his audience was not entirely sympathetic, started to overact a fraction, thus making it plain that he was giving a performance. He ate heartily, as he always did, and drank a few glasses of wine. He was the first to leave, and as I opened the front door for him, he asked if he had sung for his supper adequately. "More than adequately," I assured him. Oliver's glare had slightly unnerved him, I realized. The word slightly is apt, for Quentin was doing his brilliant best to show that he hadn't been unnerved. Fame and the acceptance of his individuality by a large public would soon be his. He had been a tracer with a firm of electrical engineers, a freelance designer in advertising and publishing, and he was still working as an artist's model. The job had been given him in 1942, when there was a shortage of men for such trivial occupations as modeling. He was quick to concede, no Adonis. Periods of near starvation, interspersed with periods of compensatory overeating, had left him with a skinny chest and a pot belly. Crucifixions were his specialty, and he was sometimes required to stand on his head. In the concluding pages of How to Become a Virgin, he tells of a final visit he paid to one of the art schools he graced for so long. Quote, "Long after The Naked Civil Servant had been translated into a television play, but before I had ever been abroad, I returned one last time to St. Albion's College of Art, where I had been employed intermittently for more than 30 years. I was already standing on my piece of tat in one of the life rooms, waiting for the Housewives' Choice class to begin, when the first student arrived. She greeted me pleasantly and added, 'So you've come back to us?' 'Yes, madam.' 'You were a 9 days wonder, weren't you?' 'Yes, madam.' In quite a long time, this was the most coolly bitchy, the most English remark that had been flung at me. Malice is in no way redeemed for being true." End quote. It wasn't true, of course. At the end of his life, Quentin would be saluted as a 90 years wonder, one of the least likely survivors of the 20th century. It would be wrong to say that he lived quite often in abject poverty, for abject he certainly wasn't, even when he had to count his pennies. He was always stylish in the casts-off he had to accept from his richer friends. Style had little to do with wealth. It is a way, he understood, of presenting yourself to a hostile or indifferent world. After the disastrous relationships, if so they can be described, with Barn Door and the Czech, and the brief affair with the American soldier in the 1940s, Quentin eschewed any further personal involvement. He was content to love the human race instead. He was happy in the company of the famous, and just as happy to be among people who were simply themselves. It seemed logical that in old age he should become a film star of sorts, most notably as Queen Elizabeth I in Sally Potter's version of Virginia Woolf's Orlando. His is an extremely dignified assumption. Sally Potter recalls how good he was to work with. For her he is the true Queen of England. In puritanical, hateful London, he was out of harm's way, quite literally, when he was sitting in the darkness of the cinema, looking up at Miss Dietrich, Miss Davis, and Miss Crawford, with something close to wonderment. He was a connoisseur of their every move, their every flounce. He bathed in their glamour. Yet he was shrewdly observant, too, as Adam Mars Jones points out in his typically thoughtful appreciation of Quentin's film criticism. He reveled in the tinsel, but was able to analyze his enjoyment of it. It wasn't simply camp to him. He could recall in absolute detail entire sequences from movies he had seen many years before. He affected to despise festival films, Orlando being one of them, but he isn't consistent in his dislike. He lets slip the fact that, in Resident Alien, the selection from his New York diaries, he loved the poetic movies that Jean Cocteau made in the 40s and 50s. They have festival and art house embedded in every frame. It was through going to the pictures as a boy that he first dreamed of traveling to America. His friend and literary executor, Philip Ward, told me recently that Quentin's one serious regret was that he hadn't become an American citizen. He wanted to die an American in America, and both wishes were denied him. Philip Ward is the editor and transcriber of Quentin's definitely last collection of Bonnes Pensées. Its title is Dusty Answers, and it will be published in the United States in the near future. Philip saw a great deal of Quentin towards the end of his life, and as 3 unopened bottles of Guinness, retrieved from Quentin's second monumentally squalid room on the East Side, as a memento of him. Philip maintains that Dennis Pratt re-emerged in those final months. The Quentin mask would suddenly remove itself, and the frustrated man who had created him would clench his fist and bang on the table. The anger he never exhibited in public, the rage he felt at the way he had been treated in his youth, then came spluttering out. He even tore at his hair. He no longer wore that expression of fatuous affability he put on in restaurants and art galleries when he was being feted. Both Philip Ward and Tom Steele believed they were close friends of Quentin, or rather they got as close to him as anyone could. It was Steele who, as editor of the gay newspaper Christopher Street, persuaded Quentin to write film criticism. He was also partly responsible for Quentin's regular diary in New York Native. The papers are now defunct, but Quentin's lively and idiosyncratic writing survives. Steele is angry that some of the wittiest and most perceptive entries have been excluded from Resident Alien, and hopes that a new edition of the book will contain them. Ward and Steele are unabashedly chubby, and each remarked that Quentin often said that he liked being in the company of large men. "Let me have men about me that are fat," might have been written for him. When I first saw Mr. Travolta, he was a horrible, twitching, stick-like figure in Saturday Night Fever. Then he went away and hid, not unnaturally. Now that I've seen Pulp Fiction, I know what he was doing all those years he was away. Eating. Watching Quentin on the stage at the Duke of York's Theatre in London, I was struck by the fact that he was doing for 400 or so people what he had done for Mr. Richardson Miss Rain and Mr. Bailey in Gordon's front room 20 years earlier. It was the same routine, but enlarged to accommodate a bigger audience. He was at his best in the question and answer session in the second half of the show, when he was required to think quickly. There was suddenly a rapport with the questioners, especially with those who challenged his misogyny, his hatred of pets, and his disapproval of marriage. Larry Ashmead, one of his American publishers, recalls his hilarious response to a woman who asked him if he believed in reincarnation. This was Quentin at his sharpest, released for a moment from the neat imprisonment of the aphorism. Tom Steele is fond of a comment made by the novelist James Purdy, quote, "Quentin is more himself than anyone alive." End quote. It's an accurate observation, in that Quentin presented himself to everyone he met. There was no diffidence and none of the self-doubt he alone attributes to Germaine Greer. Even in the later years, when the smiling and nodding racket occasionally wore him down, he was the self-contained hothouse creation I had encountered in my 20s. It pleases me to read that Anne Valery, Elizabeth Wyndham, Simon Haddonstone, and others loved him. Perhaps they were granted a glimpse or two behind the carapace. That he was generous is an often repeated certainty. When he had no money, he would offer advice to those who were worse off. And of course, he was generous with his wit. On that far-off day in 1959, he dropped several names with great formality: Mr. Nazareth, Miss Garbo, Mr. the Ripper, Miss Ark. Latterly, he always referred to St. Paul as Mr. Tarsus. No one was granted a first or Christian name. That would have been too intrusive, too intimate. Lifetime acquaintances retained their titles: Mr. This, Miss or Mrs. That. Even so, most of the contributions to this book are marked by affection. Simon Haddonstone, for instance, knew him only in the last years of his life, yet his is among the warmest pieces. Quentin was ready to die, and perfectly prepared to die alone. Quote, "If you die with people, you have to be polite. You have to say, 'Give my love to Monica,'" end quote. He told an interviewer shortly before his death that he quite welcomed the prospect of an afterlife. He didn't want to meet Oscar Wilde, whom he despised, but he did want to sit down and have a chat with the likes of Mr. Hitler and Mr. Pol Pot. He had a direct question to put to them. Why? That ends the long introduction, and I thank you for listening to it.